Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the channel. I have a very exciting video for you all today. I have the opportunity to interview a man named Justin Marler, who many of you are familiar with. He needs no introduction, yet I will give an introduction anyway, a brief one. Justin was the guitar player for a very famous metal band called Sleep. He ended up becoming an Orthodox Christian monk for 8 years, if I remember the story correctly. And is now back in the world doing his thing. He's got a great outlook on everything. I had the opportunity to chat with him on the phone for a while recently. So we're going to get into all of that. So first of all, I just want to say, Justin, thank you for being here and for taking time out of your day to chat with me and my audience.
You bet. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Of course, of course. So the first question I usually ask people is if you could give us maybe an overview of your relationship with or lack thereof to God as a kid. Were you raised religious, atheist? How did all that work out when you were in your formative years?
Sure. I was raised white trash, which includes, various forms of kind of Protestant Christianity and denominations and so on. I would kind of say probably Calvary had the most impact on me. And from the age of 3, my stepmother asked me if I had a relationship with Christ, and I said I didn't know what that meant. And she told me, and she asked me if I would accept Christ into my life. And honestly, from that moment till right now, my whole life has been geared towards finding and seeking Christ and trying to follow his will in my life.
Interesting. Okay. So how old were you when you got involved in the heavy metal scene?
Well, I started playing guitar when I was a teenager. I moved from my small town in Northern California, Chico, down to the Bay Area to get involved in the music scene. And I quickly got involved in the Gilman Street sort of East Bay punk movement, which involved Green Day and later Rancid, Operation Ivy, Crimpshrine, a lot of these earlier punk bands from Northern California. And I was sleeping on a mat at Gilman Street, which is a club, homeless, and I had the opportunity to try out for this new band called Asbestos Death, and they were the precursor to Sleep, and their music was very different than what people recognize as Sleep being now. But when I tried out for the band, they liked what I was doing, they liked my contribution, and my one thing was, we got to change the name. Asbestos Death is like Napalm Death. It's way too, a copycat. And they all agreed to change the name. And so we changed the name. I had the idea of sleep deprivation. And then Al, the bass player and singer, narrowed it down to just the word sleep. And we moved forward with that. And quickly we got a record deal. And that's how it kind of started.
Okay. And which albums did you play on, just so the audience is clear?
I played on the album Volume 1, which is the only album that Sleep has out there with a 4-piece, with two singers, 2 guitars, and so on.
Gotcha. And looking back on that now as an Orthodox Christian with all this ascetic experience and all this wisdom, how do you feel about your time with the band and the music you guys were making back then?
It was, especially looking at the time, I felt like I was dabbling in evil because the music was so dark. But there's nothing evil in the lyrics or the intention, because I was there. I wrote lyrics with these guys, and we wrote the songs. We were using the Bible for some of our inspiration, but my soul was suicidal at the time, super dark and suicidal. And when I look back on that period of my life, it was so providential and so important that I was involved with that band, involved with that record, because my relationships with those guys have just endured forever. And over time, especially with Chris and Al, our spiritual lives have grown together over time. So I have no regrets being a part of that. And I think that it was a major component in my formation, and also leaning towards the monastery. Like, my pain and suffering, I was either going to kill myself or find God, and it was involved with the music at the time. And it was a component of my despair, which led me to Christ.
Wow. Okay. So when you say led you to Christ, did you go straight from Sleep to Orthodoxy, or did you play around the Protestant or Catholic world, or how did that journey go exactly?
Sure. So I was in the Bay Area. I recorded that record. I was extremely suicidal and depressed, and I decided to pull myself out of that situation. Sleep was being catapulted into what they became. And I knew that we were in the process of having record deals and touring options and money and free amplifiers and all this kind of stuff. But I needed to get out of that situation and find my purpose. And so what I did is I left there and I moved back to my small town of Chico, and I stayed with my grandmother. And while I was living there, trying to kind of discern what I was going to do with myself, I ran into an Orthodox nun. It was that straightforward. And I want to dial it back a little bit. When I was living in Oakland, I was living in a warehouse with Green Day and with people from 15 and Krypton and all this kind of stuff, all living together and going through this sort of experience together of, you know, this music scene becoming mainstream. While I was there, I was in despair, cutting myself with razor blades, very depressed. I was playing a TV screen. At that time, you could do snow channels, which means there's nothing but just black and white snow on the screen. And I would turn that on for my form of light, and I would cut myself and writhe on the floor in newspapers. And in that period, I prayed. I said, God, I have not seen your path or your church. Like, every exposure that I've had to your church has been so disconnected from the book of Acts. I just don't see it. If your church exists, if your path exists for me, show me. And it was just a couple months later where I ran into that Orthodox nun. Wow. And when I ran into her, she was very patient, very wise, and I was very confrontational with her. And when she said this is the original church that was started by the apostles, I laughed in her face. I was like, there's no way. 2,000 years ago, there's a continuum of a religious path. There's just no way. And she said, do you have an encyclopedia? And this is way before the internet. And I said, my grandmother has one. She said, go back to your encyclopedia and look up Eastern Orthodoxy and tell me what you read. So I went home, looked it up. It said exactly what she said. And I almost started bawling. Like, that prayer was 100% answered in such a random way, running into a nun. And so as soon as I encountered that, I realized, oh my Lord, this is everything I prayed for. Like, it's so straightforward, and I'm going to dive head deep into the thing. And I sure did. You know, I was devouring books and devouring content, and went to the church services that were really humble in a small basement in Chico. And I was just wide-eyed and super grateful that God revealed himself to me in that way.
That's amazing. I don't know if you've read Saint Sophroni's biography of Saint Silouan, but Saint Silouan in his writings says, to the unbelievers, I would say to God, if you're real, reveal it to me in some way, and I'll dedicate my whole rest of my life to you. And the story you just told reminds me a lot of that quote. 100%. So you have this conversation with this nun, you are pouring through these books, you become convinced Orthodoxy is true. Do you go straight to being interested in monasticism, or were you a layman for a while and it took you some time to discern your path?
It was just a few months, a couple months period of time where I encountered the nun and encountered these books and so on. I went to the used bookstore in Chico and I found a copy of the Philokalia. And I went back to her and I was like, is this one of your books? And she's like, oh my gosh, that's one of our best books. And I devoured that. And what happened is I was inquiring with her, like, what is a nun? Like, what are you doing with your life? And what does that mean? And she explained it to me. And I asked her, are there monks or men that do this? And she said, yes, there's a monastery an hour away where men are practicing monasticism. And I was like, can I go there? And at that point in time, I had tattoos and I had scars and I had done a lot of evil stuff, made a lot of mistakes. And I thought that it wasn't, you know, the right environment for me. I thought they would reject me. And she told me this, and I will never forget it. She said, you have to understand, the monastery is not some place where only the holy go. It's a hospital. Do you want healing? And I was like, please, like, heal me, help me. And she said, okay, you can go visit. And I visited during the Nativity holiday. I didn't know it was called Nativity at the time. It was winter and it was snowy. And I went up there and I just didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave. And I asked the monks over the course of a few weeks, like, can I stay? And they said, sure, you can stay. As long as you want, you know, as long as you participate in our life, you do the work, the manual labor, the prayer life, get up at the crack of dawn like we do and do everything we do, you're totally welcome. And I practiced that for a couple months, and I realized I really wanted to totally stay. So I asked their permission to go back to Chico, my hometown, and kind of tidy up some of my affairs. I had an art gallery that was exposing some of my art, and I had to get that thing shut down, get my art out of there, and do a few other things with Sleep, with the album being released and so on. And after that, I went back and I stayed for years and years and years, and it was the most important formative time of my life.
So for those who don't know, which monastery, if you're comfortable saying, did you end up joining?
I went to the Monastery of St. Herman of Alaska in Platina, Northern California, near Redding.
So
And they're still there.
Yeah, that's the monastery Father Seraphim Rose was at, correct?
Correct. Yeah, I showed up not too many years after he reposed, and so I was in the wake of his influence and his growth in his influence. Like when I first showed up, he wasn't globally known, and I got to watch how, you know, Russia was disseminating his manuscripts underground, in the threat of persecution, and his name and his writings resonated with the Russian people, and it spread throughout the world at that point. You know, everyone knows who he is now, but I was lucky to go there and be on his grave and pray on his grave daily.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So going from, this sounds like a pretty quick journey from suicidal, depressed, metal musician, homeless, to being an Orthodox Christian monk. What did you find most difficult about making that transition? Like what came up for you in the monastery? Did you ever think maybe it's not right for me, or were you just all the way in right away?
The most difficult thing, it really surfaced kind of a few months in, but being an American, raised, like I said, white trash, no real formation in virtue or theology or philosophy, or even how to function as a human being with my thoughts and my emotions. You know, none of us really are, or at least, you know, if you're raised in the American sort of culture, pop culture or whatever, we're not taught to understand our thoughts and our emotions. And that was the first thing that really surfaced, is I felt like a trash can. I felt like my soul was just filled with a ton of garbage, and I had to either face it or just keep putting garbage in it and leave the monastery. That was the hardest part, is facing myself and facing all the bad things that I've done, and also just the bad thoughts and feelings that I had on a daily basis. And when you're in a monastery, especially like that one, where there's no electricity, no running water, no distractions, no anything except dirt, prayer, and labor, you really, your mind and your heart they come to the surface very quickly. And that was the hardest part. And I knew that I needed to deal with my mind and my heart in order to get closer to God. And my intention has always been to try to always persist towards God up this hill carrying a cross. And that concept of facing my thoughts and feelings was challenging, but luckily monasticism, orthodoxy, the church has so many profound and deep teachings on this topic. It way predates all psychology. I mean, it really kind of mined psychology in the early days, and tried to understand the soul, you know, and that's why they call, you know, priests, you know, they're pastors of souls. And I had a massive wealth of knowledge and also expertise. The monks had already kind of dealt with that, and faced their thoughts and their feelings, and learned how to deal with them on a moment-to-moment basis. And so I had great teachers just right there, and I had a vast library of wisdom. And the more that I would read, the more I would just be profoundly blown away by the wisdom in the church.
Well, thank God. So when you started making this transition from the metal punk life to the monastic Christian life, did you get any pushback from other people in your life, like the other Sleep guys, when you told them, or did anyone tell you, you're crazy, what are you doing, you have this great thing going on? Or were people mostly supportive of your journey?
The guys from Sleep were amazingly supportive. If you look at their music now and their album covers, and album covers, which is Al's side project, it's all heavily influenced by the church's teachings and the church's art. And you know, Al is he's a profoundly deep person, and religion is what drives him. And same thing with the drummer Chris. He's a very devout and faithful man. Matt is just a supportive guy in general, you know. So they were all they all were sad to see me leave, and they were kind of confused why I would leave at that time, because they were, springboarding. But they also understood that I was in a dark place and needed a spiritual awakening. So they were great, and they actually Al visited a few times
Oh, wow.
the monastery, and he loved the monks, the monastic life, and the imagery and everything about it. He thought it was just amazing. So it became part of the Sleep's sort of lore, the Sleep story, that one of the members left and became a monk. And to this day, it's kind of part of the story, which I'm actually grateful for, because it's still being, God's using that right up to today. People are texting me, reaching out, emailing me, trying to find me on Facebook, whatever, because they want to talk about metal and God, that's what I'm all about right there, those two things. But I did lose a lot of friends. A lot of friends in the scene down there saw me as betraying punk rock, betraying I would say, I wouldn't have classified it this way then, but now betraying the liberal ethos.
Mm.
And I found that very interesting, because the scene preached tolerance and equality and non-bigotry, but I got treated with bigotry, straight up bigotry.
Mm.
And it goes right up even to founding Deaths of the World, and what I encountered trying to advertise that in Maximum Rock and Roll, which was a punk rock magazine back then. There's a bigotry right there. And I found that there's an allowed bigotry against Christians. And so I lost friends for sure. But my true friends really knew that this was the best thing that could ever happen to me.
Well, thank God. Now, Death to the World, which I want to talk more about in a second, I've seen lots of the aesthetic about it, or the aesthetics of it on Instagram and whatnot. And I've seen the last true rebellion as a slogan for it. Was that kind of a way of like trying to let the punk people know, like, hey, you guys are all about being a rebel? Well, this is the ultimate rebellion, is death to the self and devoting your life to God? Or how did you come up with that slogan for it?
Well, it came up because when I was in the monastery, this is before even Death of the World was even an idea, but when I was in the monastery, I was like, oh my Lord, these monks are true punks.
Mm.
They sleep on boards, they reject the world, they reject all its conventions. They live for an idea that they believe is higher than everything, and they're willing to die for it. And I was like, that is the essence of punk rock.
Mm.
Is that rejection of the world. And I just, it sunk really heavily in me when I was, the first few months when I was living there. And then at a certain point, the abbot of the monastery was, I think he was reading an article about a kid that committed suicide or something. And he's like, your generation is really lost with addiction, depression, suicidal ideation, and all this stuff. What can we do to find them? Because you found this and it's healing you. Like, it should be able to heal other people. And I was like, well, at that time, it was, like I said, pre-internet and so on. So people had zines, which were hand-done magazines it was called Kinko's back then. Now it's called Federal Express or whatever, FedEx, whatever. And they would disseminate these magazines, and they would do music, and they would go to concerts. I mean, that was kind of like the backbone of the whole thing. And he's like, well, can you do that? And I was like, well, I want to be a monk, and I want to sit here in the monastery and, work on myself and my relationship with God. And he's like, no, you need to do something. And I was like, well, I could start a magazine and see what happens. And so that phrase came out of the lifestyle that I was living, and it being the true rebellion, the true honest rebellion against all the conventions of the world that are just dripping with worldliness, Mickey Mouse and Coca-Cola and all this stuff, complete rejection.
Awesome. So what were some of the problems you had trying to get that going, and how did you ever convince a punk rock magazine to start including advertisements for Orthodox Christianity?
Well, I was rejected by the punk rock magazine to do a paid advertisement. And in their magazine, they have paid advertisements for absolutely everything under the sun, But this one thing, they're like, no, you can't advertise. And I was like, man, the bigotry is deep here. Like, it's fascinating how justified they are in their bigotry in this one area. So I just did it on my own and started disseminating it at punk rock clubs and record stores and so on, just putting stacks out. And other people in the Orthodox world would catch wind of this And some people thought it was absolutely horrid what I was doing, using the church and using the imagery, using the quotes from the saints to try to kind of worldify it, to make it, accessible to the modern man. They thought that was horrible. And when I would get this criticism, I would look at the magazine and I'm like, it's all just icons and just quotes. It's the only difference is it's all black and white and it's cut and pasted, with tape at Kinko's. I mean, that's, and the presentation that I was doing was, nothing about it was antithetical to the church. So I was like, I'm sorry, but I'm going to keep doing this. And I started getting letters from people all over the place, like tons of mail coming in from people in prisons, people wanting to commit suicide, and they found this zine and a quote in there helped them to not commit suicide. Like tons of this mail, and we just kept doing it. And it kept spreading, and we kept printing it, and we kept sending boxes off to churches, and the churches would go disseminate it in their town at their record stores and so on. And it kept growing and growing and growing until finally the Washington Post caught wind of it, and they did a 2nd-page article on this, and they called it "From Punks to Monks," I believe it's called. And then it went to Utne Reader, and then it went to Dr. Dobson, which is a Protestant organization focused on the family, I think they're called. And they were fascinated by it because they are having they were losing young people to modern subculture pretty rapidly, and they wanted to know how to connect to them, and they were like, you seem like you know how to connect to these people. And so I kept having pastors and Protestant ministers and people in church, prison ministry reaching out to me to try to understand what I'm doing and how it's working, and it just kind of, it's one of those God things. You just kind of put something out there and God says, okay, I'm going to use that, and it just gets used, and you're just kind of grateful that it's being used at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you still involved with it today?
I'm in contact with the guy who runs it now, Father John, and I've written articles for the newer versions of the zine, and he also has helped me to update Youth of the Apocalypse, which is the book that was sprung out of the magazine Death of the World, for the update. So we're pretty close to having the update on Youth of the Apocalypse, thanks to Father John, who runs Death of the World. And we'll have that out there hopefully in 2022. That's the goal.
Awesome. Yeah, I've been wanting to read it, but I haven't been able to find a copy. So I'm very excited to hear that. Yeah. So you're in the monastery for 8 years. Why did you end up going back to the world after you were a monk? And it sounds like having such profound experiences, not only of healing yourself, but also being able to use the healing that you received to help all these other people through this magazine.
After so many years in the monastery, there were some issues that were going on in the monastery with church politics. They were no longer under a bishop, and in Orthodoxy, apostolic succession is a major part of how the religion gets, it contains itself over time. And so I had some problems with that. That was a big problem for me. And at the time, there weren't a whole lot of monasteries in the US or English speaking. And so I was kind of faced with the decision of, what am I going to do with this? Do I want to be in this monastery that has severed itself from apostolic succession or not? And so I chose to leave, and I immediately went to a Greek priest and tried to understand how I do that, and the bishop eventually blessed me and understood my situation and kind of blessed me to return to laymanship. And I've been a layman ever since.
What was that like after 8 years in that austere setting to come back to the world of Walmart and bright lights and cars and traffic?
Jarring, shocking, disappointing, horrifying. All the negative things you could say. The world, even in those few years, the world had changed dramatically. And it's weird to kind of step out of it and be out of it for a while, and then go back into it and see the change. Like in just that span of time, things got more evil. People got more depressed. People got more angry, more divided. And then you have the internet. It was happening at that time too. So then you have this sort of global library that contains everything imaginable, and there is no filter. So you can have everything from To Kill a Mockingbird to this absolutely horrifying porn, and all of the above, including movies. The first thing my dad did is he took me out to see a movie, and he's like, "This is a really good historical movie," and it was called Saving Private Ryan. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's very accurate, but for a person that was in a monastery for so long, it profoundly hurt me. It hurt my soul, the violence of it and the reality of it. And I couldn't digest modern media. It was too horrifying for me. But yeah, leaving the monastery and being exposed to the world, even now to this very day, I still, I've kind of numbed out to it because I'm used to it, which is unfortunate. But we still have to battle all that stuff, the modern world and all of its garbage,
Now, when you came back and you were exposed to this world of violence and internet and all the chaos, did the thought ever go through your head to seek out a different monastery, or at that point were you committed, you felt like your path was to go back and be a lay person?
With help from a priest, I believe at the time my job was to, okay, I learned all of this in the monastery, and my soul has been modified and changed in a positive way. I want to reflect that in the world now. And that's been my goal since then, is to try to represent that in the world best I can, how feeble I may be. So I kind of have that. But honestly, in confession for the past several years, I always get to the point where I'm talking about guilt for leaving. He who puts his hand to the plow and turns back. And I have that quote in my mind all the time, But the priests and the bishops that I've talked with, they always tell me, like, stop it. Stop it. You're blessed to do what you're doing in the situation that you're in. It was unusual. And they even tell me that I was lucky to be able to have both feet in both worlds, And I try to tell myself that too, is like, I was lucky to have that experience, and I was lucky to go through the tantraing process and the isolation and the solitude and all that stuff. And I'm also very fortunate to be in the position I am now, which is being in the world, having children, having a wife and family, and trying to do the best that I can, representing Christ and his church, and I'm reminded daily that what I'm doing is blessed in its own way, because of, like I said, all the people that reach out to me. It's just an endless flow of people that are reaching out and wanting to understand and ask questions and wanting to, there's so many people that they reach out to me out of the blue and they say, just so you know, I was a huge fan of sleep and I'm baptized Orthodox now.
Wow, thank God.
And I'm like, glory be to God. If there's I don't feel like I can be saved on my own, because I'm a wretched person. I'm a class A douchebag. But if that can help me, I am in,
Yeah. Well, thank God. I want to go back to what you said about Saving Private Ryan for a second. I mean, obviously in terms of script, cinematography, top tier movie, right? But there is a lot of gore. There's that opening scene on the beach where the guy's like carrying his arm, looking for these other body parts and intestines coming out. Someone asked me on a live stream just this week about, should Orthodox Christians watch The Sopranos? And this turned into a conversation about consuming secular media, music, TV, movies, video games, etc. And some people were saying, well, I just watch this stuff for fun. It's just comedy to me. Like, I don't take it too seriously. So you, with this profound monastic training of controlling the nous and the information, the sensory information that goes into it, what would you say to those people that say, well, I can watch this kind of degenerate stuff, sex scenes on TV. It's not a big deal to me. Do you think that's a safe thing to do? Do you think it's smart, or do you think there's some self-deception going on?
So I've wrestled with this problem my entire adult Christian life. And it goes back to music, because I'm in music, and I've done music after, I've recorded records after being in the monastery, and the music is punk rock or metal or whatever. And I've talked with my priest and other folks in the church about this very topic. And here's my sort of download on that question. Exposure to any form of media, be all your senses, really. Your senses are your gateways into your soul. You really should expose your soul to holy things. The end goal, I believe, is to stop exposing yourself to worldly stuff altogether. I really believe that. I mean, even in Orthodox, cultures, they had folk music, which is the, worldly secular music, and they had the church music, and they were able to balance that stuff. But in our times, it's crazy what you can expose yourself to. I mean, it's shockingly absurd what you can expose yourself to with your senses, your sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. So what I've done is, even after leaving the monastery, my wife and I love punk rock and metal, and we'd listen to it all the time. And at a certain point, I'm like, I gotta just stop. And so I stopped, and I think that process of letting go of worldly entertainments, I think we really, on our path, we really should be striving towards that, shedding all of that and purifying our lives and purifying our hearts. There's no need to watch The Sopranos. There's just no need for it, And I'm saying that as a hypocrite because I watch shows, there's a couple shows that, my wife and I enjoy that are not like Sopranos, but yeah, they're just worldly shows. And, I really do. There's a lot that I abstain from because I just don't want to expose my soul to it. There's a lot that I just cut off and say, no, I can't do it, But my goal, yeah, is, I'm turning 50 here pretty soon, and I'm that much closer to death. And I really do need to keep shedding worldly stuff and keep leaning on the church and all of her wisdom. And I think we all should be doing that, is shedding it really. I mean, putting up at least some boundaries for some of this stuff is crucial. But the end game is to not have it in your life at all.
Amen. Yeah, it's easier said than done. I've tried to curate in my own life by saying, yeah, I love metal, but I'll just listen to Stryper and Theocracy and Demon Hunter. Yeah. And even then, sometimes even just the dissonant sound, or if they get into like a vocal fry type scream, it can be a little bit jarring to the soul. Even if the lyrics are Christian.
Demon Hunter, I love that band, by the way.
Oh, they're so good. They're so good. So I got a ton of questions from my audience when I let them know I might get the chance to interview you. Some of this we have discussed. Some of it we have not. Someone asked me about an acoustic album you made as a monk called Lamentation. Can you talk about that at all?
Sure. So that abbot of that monastery, when he was asking me how to reach out to young people, he said, well, you're a musician. Can't you do music? And I was like, I really don't want to. I don't have a guitar. I don't really have it in me. And he's like, no, you should try. So they got me a guitar, and I started messing around with acoustic stuff, kind of in the vein of like when I was hanging out with Green Day, we would do acoustic, but it was 3-chord punk, but it was acoustic. And that was what I knew. And so I kind of started doing that. And then I started listening to some Russian folk singers and started integrating some of their kind of folky sounds and folky ideas. And I amassed a collection of songs, and the head of the monastery would have me test it out on the monks and the nuns. After trapeza, he would say, hey, and Father John would like to do, a song or two for you. And I would do these songs, and it was awkward, to be honest, very awkward. But he liked it a lot, and he was a huge supporter of what I was writing and doing. And so he found a person to record it and put it at that time on cassette. And we disseminated that along with the Death of the World, and also at that point, Youth of the Apocalypse too. And so that album called Lamentations is definitely a combination of my younger despair and the resolution of finding hope in God. And you can see it in those songs, this despair, this kind of tug of war of the two, which is what I was trying to do, because I wanted to have them, the songs resonate with young people, but I also wanted them to be not anti-religious, obviously. And at that point, after the album came out, I was asked to do a tour. And so I, as a monk, went on a tour and gave concerts in churches and all kinds of little spots throughout the US. And it just kept the message going of ministry, really.
Awesome. So one of the commenters has a question, because the genre of music that Sleep is most known for, like Sleep's Holy Mountain, Dragonaut type of stuff, other bands, Electric Wizard and whatnot, very heavy focus on marijuana, smoking marijuana, experiences you have on marijuana.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the use of marijuana in that genre of music, and also as an Orthodox Christian?
That's a tough one. And I think that the church, quote unquote, church/jury is out on this question. I personally believe it's sort of in the category of drinking wine. I don't see it as an evil. However, I know a lot of people that use it on a very regular basis, and that is absolutely horrible. It's just not right, and it's also bad for the synapses in the brain. Like a glass of wine is not going to damage your brain, but smoking those type of things frequently is actually bad for your lungs. It's bad for your body. It's bad for your soul, and it's kind of a distraction from what we're supposed to be doing as Christians. So I don't condemn people for using it, but I don't think it's very wise to use it.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough.
And by the way, I hate the fact that sleep is associated with that. I hate it. And it's funny because Al, the main founder of Sleep and the lead singer and bass player, he's sober. I mean, he's been sober for years. So it's kind of funny that all this imagery and all this stuff is almost for theatrics, you know, and part of the story of the band, not really what's going on. Like none of them, I think, are smoking weed at all.
Well, you're in a genre called stoner metal. You're going to get some associations. So a commenter says he just got a copy of your book. I don't know how. I haven't been able to find it. He says maybe ask him how different it would be if you tried to approach the same book today. Would you have a different take on it, or have you been rewriting it, or are you happy with the way it came out the first time?
That's a great question. The bulk of the book is, when I reread it, there's tons of grammatical problems. And when the nuns and the monks were editing it before it went out, they were like trying to edit it to death. And at a certain point, one of the monks was like, you know what? We're killing it by making it grammatically right or whatever. So they kind of pulled back on their edit, and they're like, you know, this is kind of more of an emotional piece and also a kind of a philosophical piece. It's not about proper grammar, you know? So when I reread it, I'm bothered by some of that stuff. And so, but we're leaving it in there. But the stuff that it was really surprising to me is that how much sin has evolved since that book was written. It was written, I think, in '95. The options for sin have multiplied in ways that are unimaginable back then. So in the rewrite, I had to add a lot of new content related to the internet and social media and the passions that are kind of more modern related. So yeah, part of it's timeless, but there's sections of it that needed to be added to be more current for sure.
Gotcha. Have you been able to reach any other musicians and been able to persuade them towards orthodoxy? I know there are some, obviously we talked about some Christian musicians. The Hanson guys are Orthodox, or at least some of them are. Victor Griffin, you know, Pentagram to Protestant. Have you been able to reach any of these people directly, or did any of your ministry have to do with it for anyone who is Orthodox in that music world?
Yes, I don't want to mention anybody, but there's been many different people that have been influenced by the connection that I have with rock and roll and metal and Christ and the Orthodox Church. And some of these folks, they're under the radar, and then they just kind of pop up and reach out to me and say, hey, it's been 10 years, just wanted to thank you or whatever. So yeah, there are definitely a lot of musicians out there that have been affected, and I'm super grateful, and so are they. They're so grateful, just like I was when I found Orthodoxy, that they chanced upon it and that it transformed their lives.
Well, thank God.
Amen.
Well, my YouTube audience here, it's just under 8,000 people at the moment. 97 or 98% of these guys are men between the ages of 18 and 45. What do you have any message for that particular demographic, problems you've seen and people who are reaching out to you from there, that you feel like this could be a good opportunity to say something to them or to help them in some way?
Yes, thank you for asking that. It's super important. There's a massive deficit in the life of a male in modern times. We have been sucked dry of the things that were held really important, even pre-Christ, by Greek philosophers. They understood this. Even Plato's Republic understood the importance of a man practicing virtue. Honestly, it goes down to practicing virtue and practicing actively unseen warfare on a daily basis. Those two things, men are so self-indulgent in this age and so distracted. And this would apply to women too, obviously, but for men, our masculinity has been just drained. And masculinity, I believe, like the Greek philosophers, comes from the practice of virtues. I think that self-control, temperance, patience, courage, justice, love, all these virtues, men, we need to relearn these, and we need to practice these, and we need to try to do these, implement these in our life on a daily basis, on a moment-to-moment basis, really. Every interaction we have with whether it's our kids, our wife, or our friends, or strangers, the code of ethics for a man should be based on those virtues and practicing unseen warfare all day long. And I think that's my message to the modern man.
That's a great message, and thank you for saying that. Especially with the internet, like you said, you can see how much pain people are in. You see what they're posting, what they're talking about, the struggles they're going through, and so many of them are alone and feel so isolated. It's so important to reconnect with these things, like you said, that are even pre-Christian, that even the pagans knew. You know, yeah. The root of the word virtue is vir. The Latin word vir means man.
Yeah.
We don't talk about this enough.
I do want to say that,
oh, sure.
Just an insert here. We've seen in the past 5 to 7 years an influx in young men out of the counterculture, beards, tattoos, music, all this stuff coming out of pagan chat rooms and the like, and finding orthodoxy through those means. And there's a hunger in the modern man for ritual and for virtue that's not being met out there. And I'm seeing these young men come into the church, not just 1 or 2, but I gave a talk in Dallas and I gave a talk in Houston recently, and it was the same thing. These young men that are coming out of the modern sub-counterculture and finding orthodoxy as a massive solution to their life. And I hope that trend keeps going, because these young men, I'm thinking about several of my godchildren right now, they are thriving. They're absolutely thriving right now. And they've been baptized for 2-3 years, married, had children, and so on. One of these guys, who's now my godson, he showed up. Well, he reached out to me on Facebook and said, "Hey, I realized that you're in sleep and you're an Orthodox Christian and you live in Austin, and I'm in Austin right now, so I'd like to meet with you." So I met with him at a cafe or a coffee shop, whatever. And he's like looking at me wide-eyed, and he's telling me, "I came out of paganism. It didn't fulfill me. I encountered orthodoxy on a chat room, and I am dying to understand this. Where do I start?" And I said, "Well, where do you stand with Jesus Christ?" And he's like, "I have no idea." And I was like, "Well, that's the starting point. Like, start with him, and if you embrace him, then you're going to embrace his church and all that orthodoxy provides." And he came back to me a week or 2 later on Facebook and said, "Can we meet again?" And we met, and he's like, "I believe in Jesus Christ. Now what?"
Oh, wow.
I think there's a hunger out there with young men.
So if any of the young guys listening to this who are, they resonate with your story, maybe they recognize themselves somewhere in your whole journey, where are you comfortable with having them reach out to you? Like through what means or platforms?
Facebook is the safest way at this point. I despise Facebook. But at this point, it's the best way to communicate initially with people. And then if it goes, from there, I'm more than happy to have a phone conversation or text later. But message on Facebook is the way.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Justin. This is a phenomenal interview. We covered all the topics that I like you said, God and metal. That God metal in my family, that more or less covers it at this point in my life.
Yep.
So again, thank you so much for your time. And if there's anything you'd like to say to end the interview, the floor is all yours.
Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on all of us sinners.
Amen, brother. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
All right. See you later.